The first time I realized my family could erase me without raising their voices was at my own engagement party. Standing in my parents' living room with a glass of champagne I hadn't poured and a ring I hadn't really chosen. Everyone else was laughing. That was the part that stayed with me. I was 29 years old, recently promoted, newly engaged, and technically doing everything right. If you looked at the photos later, the ones my mother posted on Facebook with the caption, "So proud of our girl," you would think I was glowing. The lighting was warm, the smiles were wide. The house looked exactly like the kind of place people assumed I belonged in. But that night, standing near the fireplace while my father clinked his glass for attention, I felt something subtle but unmistakable shift beneath my feet. Not a collapse, not yet. More like the floor quietly tilting. Just enough that you didn't notice until you were already leaning. "I just want to say," my father began, his voice smooth, practiced, the same voice he used in board meetings and church fundraisers, "how proud we are of our children." Children. Plural. That word always came before the separation. He gestured first to my younger brother Mark, standing tall beside his wife, already pregnant with their second child. Mark had always stood like that, shoulders back, chin high, as if the world owed him space. He smiled easily, soaking in the attention like it was sunlight. "And of course," my father continued, "we're thrilled to officially welcome Daniel into the family." Daniel squeezed my hand. He was kind, steady, safe. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did I. Not really. "To new beginnings," my mother added quickly, lifting her glass. Everyone echoed it. "To new beginnings." Glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loudly. Music resumed. And that was it. No mention of me by name. No story about how I'd helped keep the family business afloat during the lean years. No acknowledgement that I'd moved back home at 24 to help my mother care for my grandmother while Mark finished his MBA in another state. No recognition of the promotion I'd earned just 2 weeks earlier, the one my mother had waved away with, "Well, don't get too excited. Titles change." It wasn't dramatic. No one said anything cruel. No one insulted me. They didn't have to. They just moved on, as if I were already folded into the background. I told myself I was being sensitive, that it was a party, that I'd had a long week, that not everything was a slight. That was the first lie I told myself. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, I found my mother in the kitchen wrapping leftovers. She moved with quick, efficient motions, the way she always did when she wanted to look busy enough to avoid conversation. "Hey," I said lightly. "Did Dad mean to skip me earlier?" She didn't look up. "Skip you how?" When he was talking. He mentioned Mark, then Daniel. Just thought maybe. "Oh, Claire," she sighed, finally turning toward me, irritation already forming. "You don't need constant validation. You're engaged. You have a good job. What more do you want?" It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. I just thought. "You always think too much," she interrupted. "Mark has a family. Daniel is new. This night wasn't about you." The words landed cleanly, efficiently, like a door shutting. I nodded, because that was what I had been trained to do. I helped her pack containers. I hugged her goodnight. I drove back to my apartment and told Daniel everything was fine. And for a while, I believed it was. The real problem wasn't that moment. It was what followed. How that same quiet exclusion began showing up everywhere. Subtle, but consistent. Like a pattern you don't see until it's repeated enough times to be undeniable. The family business was the first place it became obvious. Hollis and Gray Holdings wasn't flashy. It was a regional construction and property management firm my grandfather had built after returning from the Korean War. By the time I joined, it was stable, conservative, and deeply traditional. Family run, family first. At least, that was the slogan. I'd been working there for 5 years, managing compliance and contracts, quietly fixing issues no one wanted to touch. I wasn't the face of anything. I wasn't supposed to be. But I knew the numbers. I knew where the risks were buried. I knew which clients were one audit away from disaster. Mark had joined 2 years after me. He was immediately put on the leadership track. I was told to be patient. When my promotion came, it wasn't announced. It wasn't celebrated. My title changed on paper, and that was it. Mark's promotions came with dinners, toasts, emails sent company-wide. Different roles, my father explained when I asked. Different optics. Optics. Another clean word. Another door. The real fracture began the week before Thanksgiving, when my mother casually mentioned the estate meeting. What estate meeting? I asked, standing at the sink drying dishes after Sunday dinner. She paused just long enough to be noticeable. The one with the lawyer. Your father likes to do a yearly check-in. With who? With Mark, mostly. His wife. It's about the future. I turned toward her. Am I invited? She frowned, as if the idea genuinely surprised her. Why would you need to be there? That was the moment. The tilt became a drop. I'm part of the family, I said carefully. I work for the company. Yes, but Mark will be taking over one day, she replied, already moving on. You'll have Daniel. You'll have your own life. My own life. As if the one I was living didn't count. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand answers. I went home and sat on my couch in the dark, staring at the wall, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with them. And slowly, painfully, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being positioned, shifted quietly out of relevance, out of inheritance, out of decision-making. Not because I'd failed, but because I didn't fit the role they needed me to play. I was the dependable one, the helper, the one who would understand. That night, I opened a folder on my laptop and started saving documents. Contracts, emails, meeting notes. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just information. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that whatever came next, I could no longer afford to be unprepared. And as Thanksgiving approached, with its forced smiles and unspoken hierarchies, I had no idea that one dinner would turn that quiet imbalance into an open wound. By the time the turkey was carved, my place in the family would no longer be ambiguous, and neither would my response. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of forced cheer that always felt like a warning sign. I woke up early, not because I was excited, but because my body had already learned that days like this required vigilance. Daniel was still asleep beside me, breathing evenly, unaware of the internal audit already running in my head. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside, reminding myself to stay neutral. Observe. Don't react. That had become my survival strategy. By the time we arrived at my parents' house, the driveway was already full. Mark's SUV sat in its usual place, closest to the garage, like a reserved parking spot no one questioned. My mother's curtains were open wide, the house glowing with curated warmth. From the outside, it looked like a holiday magazine spread. Inside, it felt like a courtroom. My mother greeted Daniel first. "Danny, you made it," she said, pulling him into a hug that lingered just a second longer than necessary. Then she turned to me. "Claire, put the pie in the kitchen." No hug, no comment on my dress, just instructions. I complied. Of course I did. The kitchen was already buzzing. My sister-in-law, Laura, stood at the island arranging appetizers she hadn't made. My grandmother sat at the table, thin hands folded, eyes sharp despite her age. She looked at me and smiled faintly. "There you are," she said. "You look tired." "I'm fine, Grandma," I replied, leaning down to kiss her cheek. She squeezed my hand. That small gesture stayed with me longer than it should have. Dinner itself was a performance. My father carved the turkey. Mark poured the wine. Laura talked about preschools and holiday photo shoots. Daniel answered polite questions about work, always careful not to sound too ambitious or too modest. I contributed when spoken to. I laughed when expected. No one asked about my promotion. Halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. The sound cut through the table like a gavel. "I want to take a moment," he said, napkin folded neatly in his lap, "to talk about the future of the company." I felt my shoulders tense, though I kept my expression neutral. "As you all know," he continued, "Mark has been stepping up in a big way this year. The board has been very impressed." Mark dipped his head slightly, the practiced humility of someone used to praise. "We've been working closely with our legal team," my father added, "to make sure everything is structured properly. Succession planning is important." Succession. The word echoed in my chest. And so, my mother chimed in, smiling brightly, we'll be making a few formal changes after the new year. I waited. Everyone did. Mark will be named Director of Operations, effective January 1st, my father said. He'll also be added to the trust. The trust. My fork paused mid-air. Laura gasped softly, hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God, that's amazing. Mark reached for her hand, squeezing it. I'm honored, he said. Really. I looked at my plate. Mashed potatoes, green beans, perfectly arranged. My appetite vanished. And Claire, my mother said suddenly, turning toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We're so proud of how supportive you've been. This transition will be much smoother with your help. Supported, not included, not acknowledged. Useful, of course, I said calmly, happy to help. Daniel glanced at me, confusion flickering across his face, but he stayed quiet. No one mentioned my name in connection with the trust. No one explained why. No one thought they needed to. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. I remember my grandmother watching me carefully, her gaze lingering longer than usual. I remember Mark refilling his glass without asking. I remember my mother reminding me to bring leftovers for Daniel's lunch tomorrow. After dessert, as people drifted into the living room, my grandmother motioned for me to follow her down the hallway. Her bedroom smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She closed the door behind us with more effort than usual and gestured for me to sit. They didn't tell you, she said quietly. Tell me what? I asked, though I already knew. She studied my face, as if deciding how much truth I could handle. The will, she said. They updated it last spring. My stomach tightened. Updated it how? She sighed. The company shares, the house, everything substantial. It's all being structured to go through Mark. I waited. My chest felt hollow. And me? I asked finally. She looked away. There's a provision. A smaller one. Contingent. Contingent on what? Her lips pressed together. On you not contesting anything. The room felt smaller. They assume you wouldn't, she added softly. You're the reasonable one. I almost laughed. Almost. Why are you telling me this? I asked. She met my eyes again. Because I don't like secrets. And because you deserve to know when you're being managed. Managed. There it was. When we rejoined the family, nothing had changed on the surface. My mother was pouring coffee. My father was talking about tax strategy. Mark was showing photos on his phone. I watched them with new eyes. Every smile, every assumption, every unspoken expectation. They weren't worried about how I felt. They were confident I would fall in line. That night, back at our apartment, Daniel finally spoke. Why didn't you say anything? He asked gently. About the trust? About the promotion? I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap. Because they weren't asking. That doesn't make it right. No, I agreed. But it makes it clear. Clear about what? I looked at him. Really looked. About where I stand. He frowned. You're their daughter. I shook my head slowly. I'm their contingency plan. Silence filled the room. I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I opened my laptop and added more documents to the folder I'd started days earlier. Trust summaries, corporate bylaws, emails that mentioned succession, but never my name. Patterns. By the time I closed the computer, one truth had settled in completely. They had already decided my future without me, and soon, they were going to learn what happens when you underestimate the person who knows where all the paperwork is buried. The first thing I did after Thanksgiving was nothing. That was deliberate. I went back to work on Monday, logged into my system, answered emails, attended meetings, and did my job exactly the way I always had. Calm, efficient, invisible when necessary. I let Mark enjoy his congratulations. I let my mother forward company-wide emails praising family leadership. I let my father walk past my office without stopping. From the outside, I looked unchanged. Inside, I was reorganizing everything. There's a moment when you realize you've been placed in a role without your consent that feels like grief. Not loud grief, not the kind that makes you cry in the shower. It's quieter than that. It's the loss of a future you didn't know you were still hoping for. I let myself feel that for exactly one night. After that, I moved into analysis. Hollis and Gray had always been a family business. On paper. But in practice, it ran on a patchwork of legacy habits and undocumented dependencies. Systems built by people who trusted each other too much. Processes no one had ever questioned, because that's how we've always done it. I knew where those systems were fragile, because I'd been the one fixing them for years. Mark understood strategy in theory. I understood execution. That difference mattered more than anyone realized. The first anomaly showed up in a routine compliance review. A property acquisition from 3 years earlier. A minor discrepancy in the valuation paperwork. Not illegal, just sloppy. The kind of thing that never mattered until someone outside the family started paying attention. I flagged it quietly and kept going. By mid-December, I had a list. Nothing dramatic, no smoking guns, just patterns of favoritism turned into operational blind spots. Contracts Mark had rushed through, vendor relationships based on loyalty instead of performance. Decisions made because they looked good at a dinner table, not because they made sense on a balance sheet. I didn't confront anyone. I watched. At home, the atmosphere shifted in small ways. My mother called more often, always with a question disguised as concern. "Are you feeling okay, honey? You've seemed distant." "I'm fine," I said truthfully. "Work isn't overwhelming you, is it?" "No." "Well, don't forget family is important too." I bit back the urge to ask which part of the family she meant. Daniel noticed the change before anyone else. He always did. "You're different," he said one night as we ate takeout on the couch. Not upset, just focused. "I am focused." "On what?" I considered lying, then decided not to. "On making sure I don't get boxed out of my own life," I said. He studied me carefully. "Are you planning something?" "I'm preparing," I replied. "There's a difference." Christmas came and went with the same polished tension as Thanksgiving. Gifts were exchanged, smiles were practiced. Mark announced Laura's pregnancy to distant relatives as if it were breaking news, even though everyone already knew. My gift from my parents was a leather planner, embossed, expensive, empty. "Thought you could use it," my mother said, "to organize your thoughts." I thanked her and set it aside. What she didn't know was that my thoughts were already very organized. January arrived quickly. Mark's new title went into effect. His office was moved closer to my father's. Mine stayed where it was. The first official leadership meeting of the year was standing room only. Advisors, lawyers, consultants, people who had been circling the business for years, waiting for a generational shift. Mark stood at the head of the table, confident, relaxed. He spoke about vision, growth, legacy. I listened. Halfway through, one of the external advisors asked a question about risk exposure on a new development project. Mark answered smoothly, quoting numbers that were technically correct, but contextually misleading. I could have corrected him. I didn't. Instead, I made a note. After the meeting, my father pulled me aside. "Good meeting," he said. "Mark handled himself well." "He did," I agreed. "You've been very quiet lately." "I've been busy." He nodded, satisfied. "That's good. We'll need you to help Mark transition. He'll rely on you." Rely on me. The irony didn't escape me. 2 weeks later, the lawyer called. Not my parents' lawyer. Mine. I hadn't hired him yet, not officially, but I'd consulted with him years earlier during a contract dispute. He was discreet, precise, and very clear about one thing. People who assume you won't act are usually the most vulnerable, he'd told me then. Now he called to let me know something interesting. "There's been an inquiry," he said. "Nothing formal, yet. But someone outside the family has been asking questions about governance structure, succession, fiduciary responsibility." "Who?" I asked. He paused. "A minority investor. Quiet one. Holds less than 5%, but has deep pockets." I smiled faintly. "I see," I said. "Thank you." That night, I opened the leather planner my mother had given me. On the first page, I wrote one sentence. If they want me silent, they should have made sure I had nothing to say. The following week, my grandmother asked me to visit her. She was thinner than before, quieter, but her eyes were still sharp. "They're rushing," she said, without preamble. "Who?" I asked. "Your parents, Mark. They're trying to lock things down before anyone gets nervous." "About what?" She leaned closer. "About control." I met her gaze. "Do you regret it?" She didn't ask what I meant. She knew. "Yes," she said simply. But regret doesn't change documents. Only action does. She reached into her nightstand and handed me a folder. I shouldn't, she said, but I trust you more than I trust their intentions. Inside were copies, old ones, early drafts of the trust, versions that included my name, clauses that had been revised quietly, evidence of choice, not inevitability. When I left her house that evening, the weight of the folder felt heavier than paper. It felt like responsibility. I didn't know yet how everything would unfold. I didn't know how far they were willing to go to keep me contained. But I did know this: the story they were telling themselves required my silence, and I was done cooperating. As January bled into February, the pressure increased. Meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions made without my input, subtle reminders that my role was supportive, not strategic. They thought the transition was complete. They thought I had accepted my place. They were wrong. And soon, a single email would force all of us to confront the truth none of them were ready to face. The only question was how much damage they would do before they realized I was no longer protecting them. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 8:17 a.m., and at first glance, it looked harmless. Subject line: Request for clarification, Hollis and Gray Holdings. No exclamation points, no legal letterhead, just a polite inquiry forwarded to the executive team, my father included, with Mark copied. I was included by mistake, or because someone assumed I was still invisible. The sender was an analyst from a private equity firm based in Chicago. Small fund, quiet reputation. The kind of people who didn't ask questions unless they already suspected the answers. They wanted clarification on governance structure, voting rights, and succession authority tied to several properties under a holding subsidiary I happened to manage compliance for. I read the email twice, slowly. Then I smiled. Within minutes, my father was standing in my doorway. "Did you see this?" he asked, holding his phone up like evidence. "Yes," I replied calmly. I was copied. His jaw tightened. That wasn't intentional, I figured. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Do you know why they're asking these questions?" "Yes," I said. "Because the structure is opaque and the transition hasn't been documented properly." "That's not your concern," he said quickly. I met his eyes. "It is if my name is on the filings." Silence stretched between us. "You're reading too much into this," he said finally. "Mark is handling it." "Mark gave them preliminary numbers last quarter," I replied. "They didn't line up with the underlying risk exposure." "That's internal." "So is the truth," I said. He studied me. Something like irritation mixing with something closer to unease. "You're overstepping." "No," I said evenly. "I'm responding to a direct inquiry." He exhaled sharply. "Let Mark handle it." "I will," I said, "if he asks." He didn't like that answer, I could tell. The meeting that followed later that day was tense, in a way that didn't require raised voices. Mark sat at the head of the table again, confident but distracted. The advisors were more alert than usual. Questions were sharper, less deferential. The illusion of control was thinning. When the Chicago firm joined via video call, their lead partner didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We're evaluating a potential minority position," he said. "But before we proceed, we need clarity. Who ultimately holds decision-making authority over asset liquidation?" Mark answered quickly. "That would be me, in coordination with my father." The partner nodded. "And where is that authority documented?" Mark hesitated. "Just long enough. It's outlined in our internal succession plan," he said. The partner smiled slightly. "We'd like to see that." My father leaned forward. "Those documents are private." "Of course," the partner replied. "Then we'll need confirmation through public filings." All eyes shifted to me, not because I was the most important person in the room, but because I was the only one who knew exactly what those filings said. "I can provide that," I said calmly. Mark turned toward me, surprise flashing across his face. "You don't need to." "I oversee compliance," I continued. "It's within my scope." The call ended with promises to follow up. No commitments, no assurances, just pressure. Afterward, Mark pulled me aside in the hallway. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. "That was due diligence," I replied. "You made me look unprepared." "You were," I said. His expression hardened. "You're supposed to be on my side." I looked at him carefully. I'm on the company side. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed. It isn't. That night, my mother called. I don't like what you did today, she said without greeting. I answered a question. I replied, you embarrassed your brother. I clarified a structure. She sighed dramatically. Why are you doing this? I thought about that for a moment. Because I was excluded from decisions that affect me, I said. And now those decisions are being examined. You're being vindictive. I'm being accurate. She went quiet. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. You know, she said slowly, this kind of behavior doesn't look good. People might start to think you're difficult. I almost laughed. People already think that, I said. They just haven't said it out loud. The next week, my access changed. Not officially. Nothing documented. Just subtle delays. Fewer calendar invites. Files I used to reach easily now required approval. They were trying to contain me. What they didn't realize was that containment only works if the person doesn't already have copies. I met with my lawyer that Friday. They're nervous, he said after reviewing the documents my grandmother had given me. And they should be. Am I protected? I asked. He nodded. You're more than protected. You're necessary. That word landed differently. Necessary. For years, I'd been useful, supportive, reliable. Now, I was necessary. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure from the outside increased. More inquiries, more quiet requests for transparency. The Chicago firm wasn't alone anymore. Mark started making mistakes, small ones at first. Missed calls, inconsistent messaging, decisions rushed through without proper review. My father grew quieter, more withdrawn. The confidence he wore like armor was beginning to crack. One evening, as I was leaving the office, he stopped me. We need to talk, he said. I nodded. About what? About expectations, he replied. About loyalty. I studied him. The man who had taught me how to read contracts at 14, who had once told me I was the sharpest mind in the family. What do you expect from me? I asked. He hesitated. That you remember who gave you your start. I held his gaze. And I expect to be treated as more than a placeholder. He didn't answer. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. A preliminary audit request landed on Mark's desk the following Monday. Not formal, not yet. But it carried weight. And for the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. He knocked on my door that afternoon. We need to align, he said, before this gets out of hand. I gestured for him to sit. Align how? I asked. He lowered his voice. You need to stop feeding information to outsiders. I haven't fed anything, I replied. I've answered what was asked. That's the same thing. No, I said calmly. One is transparency. The other is manipulation. He clenched his jaw. What do you want? There it was. The question they should have asked years ago. I leaned back in my chair. I want my seat at the table. He scoffed. You're not part of the succession. Then you shouldn't need me, I replied. Silence filled the room. Outside, the company hummed along, unaware that its foundation was shifting. Mark stood up slowly. You're making a mistake. I looked up at him. No, I said. I'm correcting one. As he left, I opened my laptop and drafted an email. Not to my family. To the Chicago firm. It was time to stop waiting for permission. And once that line was crossed, there would be no quiet way back. I didn't send the email right away. I wrote it, saved it as a draft, and closed my laptop. That pause mattered. Not because I was unsure, but because once it went out, the narrative would no longer belong solely to my family. It would belong to facts, timelines, and people who had no emotional investment in keeping things comfortable. That night, Daniel watched me from the kitchen doorway as I poured myself a glass of water. You're thinking, he said. I'm deciding, I replied. Is there a difference? Yes, I said. Thinking is private. Deciding is permanent. He didn't push. He never did. That was one of the reasons I had chosen him, even if I hadn't fully understood it at the time. He knew when to stand close and when to step back. I slept well that night. The next morning, I hit send. The email was short, professional, precise. I offered to provide documentation regarding governance structure, compliance oversight, and historical decision-making authority. I copied only one person internally, myself. By noon, the response came. Thank you. We appreciate your willingness to engage directly. Engage directly. That phrase would come back to haunt my parents. The shift was immediate. Within 48 hours, Mark's calendar filled with meetings that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with explanation. Advisors who had once deferred now asked follow-up questions. Lawyers requested clarifications that should have been unnecessary if the structure was as clean as they claimed. My name began appearing in conversations again. Not casually, not warmly, but necessarily. My father stopped by my office twice that week. The first time, he hovered, unsure how to begin. The second time, he didn't bother pretending. "You've put us in a difficult position," he said. "I didn't create the position," I replied. "I revealed it." He frowned. "That's semantics." "No," I said calmly. "It's accountability." He leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking older. "You don't understand how this looks." "I understand exactly how it looks," I said. "It looks like you made decisions without transparency and assumed no one would challenge them. You're part of this family. That doesn't exempt you from scrutiny." His voice hardened. "This isn't how we handle things." I met his gaze. "This is how I handle things." The tension at home escalated next. My mother stopped calling. That alone would have been notable. When she finally did, her tone was icy. "You've embarrassed us," she said. "I've answered questions," I replied. "You've sided with outsiders over your own blood." "I've sided with the truth." She laughed sharply. "You always were dramatic." I closed my eyes briefly. No, I was compliant. That silence that followed was heavy. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said finally. "I do," I replied. And I meant it. The first formal request for documentation arrived the following week. Not from the Chicago firm, but from a regional bank reviewing Hollis & Gray's credit exposure. Routine, on paper. But timing mattered. Mark panicked. He showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. His confidence stripped down to irritation and fear. "This has gone too far," he said the moment I opened the door. I stepped aside to let him in. "Would you like coffee?" "No," he snapped. "I want you to stop." I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. "You think you're being clever," he continued, "but you're destabilizing the company." "The company is destabilized," I said evenly. "I didn't do that." "You're feeding them ammunition." "They asked for facts. You could have redirected them." "Why?" "Because that's what family does." I studied him then, really studied him. The man who had never once asked me if I wanted to be redirected. "Family doesn't mean silence," I said. "It means accountability." He scoffed. "You sound like a lawyer." "I sound like someone who's been excluded from decisions that affect her livelihood." He finally sat down, rubbing his temples. "What do you want, Claire?" There it was again. "I want formal recognition," I said. "Board level, voting rights, transparency in succession planning." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You want to rewrite the will. I want the truth reflected in the documents." "That's not going to happen." "Then this won't stop." His eyes narrowed. "You're threatening us." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm describing consequences." He stood abruptly. "You're tearing this family apart." I held his gaze. "No, I'm exposing what was already broken." After he left, Daniel wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You okay?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said, and for the first time, it wasn't a reflex. The following days were a blur of meetings and emails. My role expanded without formal acknowledgement. People deferred to me in ways they never had before. Not out of respect, out of necessity. Then came the call that changed everything. My grandmother's attorney. She had been quiet since Thanksgiving. I assumed her health had declined further. When I answered, my stomach tightened. "She's made a decision," the attorney said. "About what?" I asked. "About her estate." I sat down slowly. "Is she okay?" "She's lucid, clear, and very firm." My chest tightened. "What decision?" "She's executing a codicil," he said. "Effective immediately." I closed my eyes. "She wants you present when it's signed." "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning." I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Mark. I showed up alone. My grandmother looked small in her bed, but her voice was steady. "They think I don't see," she said. "But I do." She reached for my hand. "You were never weak. You were patient." I swallowed hard. "You don't have to do this." She smiled faintly. "I do. Because silence is how injustice survives. The lawyer read the amendment aloud. It redistributed voting power. It clarified succession authority. It named me explicitly, not as a contingency, as a decision maker. When it was done, my grandmother squeezed my hand. "Now," she said quietly, "they'll have to listen." I walked out of that room knowing one thing with absolute certainty. The balance had shifted. And when my parents found out, they wouldn't thank me. They would fight. Which meant the quiet phase was over, and the real confrontation was about to begin. They found out 3 days later. Not from me, from their lawyer. I was in my office when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I watched it ring until it stopped. 30 seconds later, my father called. I let that one go too. I already knew what they were feeling. Shock first, then disbelief, then the familiar scramble to regain control. By noon, Mark was standing in front of my desk again, but this time the confidence was gone completely. He looked like someone who had just realized the floor beneath him wasn't solid. "You went to Grandma's lawyer," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You didn't tell us." "No. You went behind our backs." I looked up from my screen. "You rewrote my future without consulting me. I call that precedent." His jaw clenched. "You manipulated her." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Be careful," I said quietly. "That accusation has consequences." "She's old," he snapped. "She's confused." "She's sharper than all of us," I replied, "and she made her choice." He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "Do you have any idea what this does to the family?" "Yes," I said. "It introduces accountability. That codicil undermines everything." "It corrects something," I said. "That's not the same thing." He stopped pacing and leaned toward my desk. "Dad is furious, I assume. Mom is devastated." "I doubt that," I said. "She's embarrassed." His eyes flashed. "You're enjoying this." I shook my head. "No, I'm enduring it." The emergency family meeting was scheduled for that evening. Not at the office, at my parents' house. The same dining room where they'd announced Mark's promotion. The same table where I'd been praised for being supportive. I arrived early, as I always did. Old habits die hard. My mother was already there, sitting stiffly at the head of the table. My father stood by the window, arms crossed. Mark hovered near the kitchen doorway, like he wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. No one offered me a drink. "Sit," my father said. I did. He didn't waste time. "Explain yourself," he said. "I don't need to," I replied calmly. "The documents are clear." "You went around us," my mother snapped. "To your grandmother, to outsiders." "I went to the only person who still saw me clearly," I said. "That's manipulative," Mark said. "No," I said. "What you did was manipulative. You just didn't expect resistance." My father slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. You've created instability. Investors are asking questions. Banks are circling." "Because the structure was fragile," I said. "That's not my fault." "You could have handled this internally," my mother said. "I tried," I replied. I was excluded. Silence followed. "You've always been resentful," she continued. "Ever since Mark joined the company." "That's not true," I said. "I was loyal. There's a difference." My father leaned forward. "What do you want?" There it was again. The question they only asked when they felt cornered. "I want formal recognition of my role," I said. "Board seat, voting rights, clear succession language that doesn't erase me." "And if we say no?" Mark asked. "Then this continues," I replied evenly. "With more eyes on it." "You destroy your own family," my mother said. I looked at her carefully. "No. I'd stop sacrificing myself to preserve a lie." She stood abruptly. "After everything we've done for you." I didn't respond. My grandmother's voice cut through the tension from the doorway. "That phrase needs to stop," she said. We all turned. She stood there with her cane, posture straight despite her frailty. Her presence shifted the room instantly. "You've done plenty," she continued, "and you've taken more." My mother rushed toward her. "Mom, you shouldn't be here." "I'm exactly where I should be," my grandmother said. "This is my mess, too." She looked at my father. "You assumed Claire would accept whatever scraps you left her. Because she always had." He didn't deny it. She turned to Mark. "And you let them build your confidence on her silence." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. "I changed the documents because I finally saw the pattern," my grandmother said. "And because I won't be complicit anymore." The room felt smaller. "This isn't revenge," she added, glancing at me. This is correction. My father exhaled slowly. You're forcing our hand. No, she replied. She is reclaiming it. That night ended without resolution, which told me everything I needed to know. The next week, the pressure turned overt. I was removed from 2 internal committees temporarily. Mark attempted to reassign part of my portfolio. A memo circulated about streamlining authority. I forwarded it to my lawyer. Then came the audit, formal this time. The kind with deadlines and legal weight. It wasn't my doing, but I didn't stop it. At home, Daniel watched me pack a box of documents into my bag. They're escalating, he said. Yes. Are you scared? I considered the question. No, I said. I'm steady. That surprised me too. The audit uncovered exactly what I'd expected. Not criminal behavior. Worse. Complacency, favoritism, poor oversight dressed up as tradition. The board demanded answers. My father looked tired in meetings. Mark looked exposed. And then, quietly, the board requested a private session. Without my parents, without Mark, with me. They asked me what I wanted the company to look like in 5 years, not what I would support, what I would lead. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about control. And control, once challenged, doesn't return quietly. When my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced that Friday night, her eyes red, voice shaking, I knew the next phase had begun. You've gone too far, she said. I stepped aside and let her in. No, I replied calmly. I've finally gone far enough. She stared at me like she didn't recognize the person standing in front of her. And in that moment, I realized she was right. The daughter who kept the peace was gone. What remained was someone who understood leverage and was no longer afraid to use it. The first thing my mother did when she walked into my apartment was look around. Not in admiration, in assessment. Her eyes moved over the furniture, the framed photos, the bookshelf Daniel had built himself. She was cataloging, measuring, looking for evidence that I still needed her approval. You've changed, she said finally. Yes, I replied. I have. She sat down without being invited. Her coat stayed on. That told me she didn't plan to stay long. This wasn't a visit. It was a confrontation she wanted to control. You're humiliating your father, she said. People are talking. I'm aware. At church, at the club, at work, she continued. They're saying the family is divided. They're saying the truth is visible, I corrected. She shook her head. You don't understand how this looks for us. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You've said that already, and you don't care. I care, I said. Just not about appearances anymore. Her voice dropped. You're going to destroy everything your father built. I looked at her carefully. No. I'm going to stop pretending I didn't help build it too. That landed harder than she expected. You always do this, she said. You rewrite history to make yourself the victim. I don't need to rewrite anything, I replied. The records are intact. She stood abruptly. This obsession with fairness is childish. I didn't raise my voice. What you call fairness, I call boundaries. She stared at me for a long moment, then said something I'd never heard her admit before. You were easier when you didn't push back. There it was. Not anger, not betrayal, inconvenience. I nodded slowly. I know. She left without saying goodbye. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no racing thoughts, just quiet. The next morning, the board's request became official. They wanted me to present, not as support, not as backup, as lead. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, a closed session. No family present unless required. My father tried to intervene. He called, then emailed, then sent Mark. I didn't respond. Instead, I prepared. I didn't frame my presentation around emotion. I didn't mention favoritism or exclusion. I didn't talk about feelings at all. I talked about structure, risk, governance. I showed how decisions had been centralized without oversight, how informal authority had replaced documented process, how that created exposure no investor would tolerate. And then I showed the alternative, a revised structure, transparent succession planning, independent oversight, clear voting rights. My name appeared in the document only once, as Chief Operating Authority, not because I demanded it, because it made sense. When Thursday arrived, I walked into that boardroom without hesitation. Daniel texted me a single sentence before I went in. Whatever happens, I see you. That was enough. The presentation lasted 47 minutes. No interruptions. When I finished, the room was quiet. One of the independent directors spoke first. Why hasn't this been proposed before? I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, because I wasn't asked. Another director nodded slowly. You're asking now. Yes, I said, formally. They asked questions, detailed ones, hard ones. I answered all of them. At the end, the chair leaned back and said, we'll need time to deliberate. I understand, I replied. I stood to leave. Claire, he added. Thank you. That word followed me out of the room like an echo. 2 days later, the decision came down. Not everything I wanted, but enough. I was granted a permanent board seat, voting rights, and formal authority over operations and compliance. My father retained his title. Mark kept his. But the hierarchy had changed, and everyone knew it. The reaction was immediate. My father didn't call. Mark did. You planned this, he said. I prepared, I replied. You used the board against us. I used governance, I said. This isn't over. No, I agreed. It isn't. The final escalation came from somewhere I didn't expect. Laura. She called me late one evening, her voice tight. You need to fix this, she said. Fix what? My family is under scrutiny now, she snapped. Mark is stressed. This pregnancy. I didn't cause the scrutiny, I said. But you triggered it. No, I replied. The structure did. She inhaled sharply. You always have an answer. That's why I'm here, I said. You've ruined Thanksgiving, Christmas, everything. I paused. I didn't ruin them. I just stopped performing. She hung up on me. The following week, my grandmother passed quietly in her sleep. The grief was real, deep, complicated. At the funeral, my mother didn't look at me. My father nodded stiffly. Mark stood apart, his hand on Laura's back. The lawyer approached me discreetly afterward. She anticipated this, he said softly. Everything is in order. I nodded. I already knew. What I didn't expect was the reading of the personal letter she'd left me. I read it alone that night. You were never invisible. They just benefited from pretending you were. Don't let them rewrite you again. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with the documents. The following Monday, the board requested a follow-up meeting. This time, the topic was leadership continuity, and this time, my parents were in the room. The chair spoke plainly. We need to address a question that's been deferred for too long, he said. Who is actually running this company? The silence was unbearable. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. The chair turned to me. Claire, he said, are you willing to step fully into that role? I didn't answer right away. I looked at my parents, at Mark, at the people who had assumed I'd never choose myself. Yes, I said. That was the moment everything broke open. And there would be no way to put it back the way it was. The room didn't erupt when I said yes. There was no shouting, no dramatic walkouts, no gasps, just a quiet, collective inhale. Like everyone present had been holding their breath without realizing it. My father stared at the table. Mark looked at the wall behind me. My mother's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The chair nodded once. Then we'll proceed. That was it. No applause. No congratulations. Power rarely announces itself. It just moves. The meeting shifted into logistics, transition timelines, interim authority, external messaging. My name was spoken repeatedly, clinically, as if it had always belonged in that context. I answered questions. I took notes. I agreed to nothing I hadn't already reviewed. My parents barely spoke. When it was over, people filed out in polite silence. A few directors paused to shake my hand. One said, "This won't be easy." Another said, "It's overdue." My father waited until the room was empty. "You blindsided us," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You ignored me." He flinched at that. "You're dismantling everything we planned," my mother said, her voice brittle. "I'm implementing what you avoided," I replied. Mark finally spoke. "You don't know what you're taking on." I looked at him. "I've been carrying it for years." That ended the conversation. The announcement went out 2 days later. Carefully worded, conservative. It framed the change as a strategic evolution, not a correction. No mention of conflict, No mention of the audit, just alignment. Externally, the response was positive. Investors liked clarity. Banks liked structure. The Chicago firm resumed discussions. Internally, it was chaos. Not open rebellion. Something quieter. Passive resistance. Meetings delayed. Information trickled instead of flowed. People who used to respond immediately now took hours. I didn't call it out. I documented it. The first official decision I made was one my father hated. I separated family influence from operational oversight. Not emotionally, structurally. New reporting lines, independent review panels, clear documentation requirements. Mark lost unilateral authority over several key projects. He didn't confront me about it. He went to my mother. She went to the board. The board came back to me. I didn't change anything. That was when the rumors started. That I was cold, that I was vindictive, that I turned on my own family. I didn't correct them. The truth didn't need defending. The tension at family gatherings became unbearable. Sunday dinners stopped. Holidays were postponed. Daniel asked me one night if I missed them. I missed the version of them that didn't exist, I said. The first real confrontation came from my father. He asked me to meet him for coffee. Neutral territory, public enough to keep things contained. He looked tired, older than I remembered. You've changed the dynamic, he said after a few minutes. Yes. You've made us equals, he continued. No, I replied. I've made the structure honest. He sighed. You could have waited. For what? For us to come around. I shook my head. You would have waited me out. He didn't argue. That told me everything. Was it worth it? He asked. I thought about that. About the years of silence, the careful compliance, the way I'd learned to disappear, to survive. Yes, I said, because I didn't lose myself this time. He looked at me for a long moment. I don't recognize you. I met his gaze. That's because you never looked closely before. He left without finishing his coffee. At work, the pressure intensified. A supplier Mark favored failed a review. I terminated the contract. A senior manager resigned quietly after an ethics complaint surfaced. I didn't intervene. The message was clear. This wasn't personal. It was policy. Mark stopped speaking to me entirely. Laura sent a single email asking if I'd consider stepping back for the sake of family harmony. I didn't respond. The breaking point came in March. A document surfaced. An unsigned draft amendment to the will, dated the previous year. It would have removed my name entirely. Someone leaked it. I didn't need to guess who. The board called an emergency session. My parents were present. My mother tried to speak. The chair stopped her. We need to understand, he said calmly, why this document exists. No one answered. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not triumph, finality. When the meeting ended, the board made a decision without me in the room. They returned 10 minutes later. The structure stands, the chair said. And further, we recommend a formal review of prior governance decisions. My father's shoulders sagged. Mark looked at me for the first time in weeks, not with anger, with something closer to fear. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city quiet outside the window. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. The next phase wouldn't be about control. It would be about consequences, and not everyone would survive. As I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Privately. You don't know everything yet. I stared at the screen. I knew who it was. And I knew that whatever he was about to reveal would change the story again. I replied with one word, tomorrow, and set the phone down, already preparing for the truth they'd worked so hard to bury. The message came from Mark. I didn't save the number. I didn't need to. We met the next afternoon at a quiet cafe near the river, the kind of place where conversations dissolved into background noise, and no one paid attention unless you asked them to. Mark arrived late. He always did when he was trying to regain control of a situation he'd already lost. He didn't order anything. I didn't want to do this here, he said, sitting down across from me. But I can't talk at the office. Not anymore. You can talk, I replied. You just can't manage the outcome. That landed harder than I intended. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I didn't leak the document, he said. I didn't accuse you, I replied. He exhaled. Mom did. There it was. She found the draft in Dad's old files, he continued. She panicked, thought if the board saw how far things had gone, they'd pressure you to step back. She didn't think it would turn into this. She always underestimates consequences, I said quietly. Mark rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. There's more. I waited. The trust isn't the only thing they changed last year, he said. There's a holding company, a separate one, quietly created. My attention sharpened. What kind of holding company? He hesitated. One that controls several of the properties, off the main books. Structured so Dad could retain influence even after stepping down. I felt a familiar chill. And who's listed? Mark looked away. Not you. Of course not. And not the board, he added. It was designed to stay invisible unless someone knew where to look. I leaned back, processing. Why are you telling me this now? Because the audit is going to find it, he said. And when they do, it won't look like legacy planning. It'll look like concealment. I studied his face. He looked exhausted, older than his years. For the first time, he wasn't posturing. Did you know? I asked. He shook his head. Not until after Grandma changed the codicil. Dad told me it was insurance. Insurance against me. And Mom? I asked. She knew, he admitted. She always knows. The silence between us stretched. You could have kept quiet, I said. You still can, he swallowed. I don't want to go down with them. That was honest. Selfish, maybe, but honest. Where are the documents? I asked. He slid a folded envelope across the table. Copies. I shouldn't have them. But I made them when I realized what they were doing. I didn't touch the envelope yet. Why trust me? He met my eyes. Because you're the only one who won't pretend this is about feelings. That surprised me. I picked up the envelope. Thank you, I said. We didn't say goodbye. I went straight to my office. The documents confirmed everything. Shell entities, overlapping authority, assets moved just enough to avoid scrutiny, but not enough to disappear. It wasn't illegal. It was worse. It was deceptive. I called my lawyer. He didn't sound surprised. This explains the resistance, he said. They weren't just protecting Mark. They were protecting control. What are my options? I asked. He paused. You can disclose, or you can wait for the audit to uncover it. And the difference? Disclosure gives you narrative control, he said. Waiting gives them plausible deniability. I closed my eyes briefly. Then we disclose. The board meeting that followed was brutal. Not emotionally, procedurally. Questions were asked. Answers were incomplete. Timelines didn't align. My father tried to explain. My mother interrupted. The chair stopped both of them. This isn't about intent, he said. It's about governance failure. By the end of the session, the board voted unanimously to place my father on temporary leave. Mark wasn't named interim. I was. When the meeting adjourned, my mother stood up, shaking. You planned this, she said, her voice barely holding. No, I replied. I refused to protect it. She looked at Mark. You told her. He didn't deny it. Her face crumpled. Something like betrayal mixed with disbelief. After everything we've done for you. I didn't respond. I walked out. That night, the family group chat went silent. No accusations. No apologies. Just absence. The press caught wind of the leave within 48 hours. Headlines were careful, but pointed. Words like transition, review, oversight. Reputation doesn't collapse in one day. It erodes. Mark resigned a week later. Not publicly dramatic. A quiet statement about personal reasons. Laura stopped wearing her ring. My mother didn't call. My father sent a single email. I should have listened. I didn't reply. The company stabilized faster than expected. Clear leadership had that effect. Investors relaxed. Banks extended timelines. People stopped whispering. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the balcony, the city lights flickering below. Do you regret it? He asked. I thought about my grandmother. About the years of silence. About the weight that had finally lifted. No, I said. But I understand it now. Understand what? That love without boundaries becomes control, I replied. And control always demands a sacrifice. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later. My mother requested a meeting. Neutral ground again. A park bench near the old house. She looked smaller, older, The confidence she'd worn like armor was gone. "You took everything," she said. I sat down beside her. "I took responsibility. You didn't have to expose us." "I didn't expose you," I said. "I stopped hiding." She stared ahead. "You could have let it be." I shook my head. "Then I would have disappeared." She was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how to talk to you now," she said. I looked at her. "You never did." She flinched. We sat there until the sun dipped lower, neither of us reaching for the other. When I stood to leave, she spoke again. "You chose yourself." "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly. "I see that now." It wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. And that was enough. As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a board update. Final review scheduled. Recommendations forthcoming. The last phase was beginning. And this time, there would be no family shield to hide behind. Only outcomes. Only records. Only the truth. Documented and final. The final review was scheduled for the second Monday of April. And by then, nothing about the situation felt personal anymore. That was the strangest part. What had once felt like betrayal, like something lodged under my ribs, had flattened into process. Checklists, calendars, deadlines. The board didn't speak in accusations. They spoke in language designed to survive subpoenas. Findings, recommendations, actions. I arrived early, as usual. The conference room was brighter than I remembered. The kind of sterile brightness meant to discourage emotion. Water pitchers lined the table. Printed packets sat at each seat. My name was already there. Centered, spelled correctly. That detail mattered more than I expected. When my parents arrived, they didn't sit together. My father chose a chair near the end of the table. My mother sat closer to the door. Mark wasn't there. He hadn't been invited. The chair opened the meeting without preamble. "This review concerns governance failures, succession misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary expectations," he said. "It is not a moral judgment. It is a structural one." My father nodded once. He looked resigned, not defiant. That too was new. The findings were read aloud. Lack of disclosure regarding parallel entities. Consolidation of authority without documentation. Intent to retain control outside board oversight. Each item landed cleanly. No raised voices, no denials. When it was over, the chair folded his hands. "The recommendation," he said, "is permanent removal of unilateral authority from any individual. Leadership will remain consolidated under interim oversight until formal restructuring is complete." He paused. "And that oversight will be led by Ms. Gray. No qualifiers. No temporary language." My mother inhaled sharply. My father didn't react at all. The vote passed unanimously. When the meeting adjourned, no one rushed out. People gathered their papers slowly, as if acknowledging that this chapter of the company's story had closed. My father approached me near the door. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "You didn't leave another way open." He nodded. "I suppose I didn't." That was the closest we would come to an apology. The formal announcement went out 2 days later. The language was careful, but the message was unmistakable. Governance restructuring, leadership realignment, commitment to transparency. My father's name was absent from the operational hierarchy for the first time in 40 years. My mother stopped attending events altogether. I expected relief or vindication. What I felt instead was stillness. At home, Daniel noticed it too. "You're quieter," he said one night as we cleaned up after dinner. "I don't need to be alert anymore," I replied. "There's nothing left to anticipate." "That sounds peaceful." "It is," I said. "And unfamiliar." Mark called once, left a voicemail. He didn't ask for anything. He just said, "I didn't think it would end like this." I didn't return the call. Laura sent a message weeks later. Polite, distant, wishing me well. The family didn't implode the way people expected. There was no dramatic estrangement, no public feud, just distance. The old patterns had lost their power. At work, the changes settled quickly. Clear authority did that. People adjusted. New processes replaced old assumptions. The company stabilized, then improved. One afternoon, an assistant asked me how it felt to finally be in charge. I considered the question. "I've been in charge for a long time," I said. "I just wasn't acknowledged." She nodded. understanding more than I'd expected. The final paperwork was signed at the end of the quarter. Trust revisions finalized. Voting rights codified. All clean. All legal. No room left for interpretation. That night, I sat alone on the balcony again, city lights stretching out below me. The letter from my grandmother lay open on the table beside my phone. You were never invisible. I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, who mistook compliance for love, who believed patience would eventually be rewarded. She had survived. But she wasn't needed anymore. My phone buzzed with a notification. An internal message from the board chair. Excellent quarter. Thank you for steady leadership. I turned the phone face down. The story everyone expected was revenge. Public humiliation. Dramatic collapse. What they got instead was something quieter. Consequences. The family still existed. Holidays would still happen. Names would still be shared. But the hierarchy was gone. And with it, the control that had shaped my life for so long. As the night air cooled, I realized something else. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the point where it finally became mine to tell. And in the next chapter, I would decide what came next not out of reaction, but out of choice. The quiet after power shifts is rarely discussed. People imagine victory as noise, applause, validation, some external signal that says you were right all along. What actually follows is something closer to withdrawal. Your nervous system, trained for years to anticipate conflict, doesn't know what to do when the threat disappears. I noticed it first on a Sunday morning. I woke up without an alarm and didn't immediately reach for my phone. There was no knot in my stomach, no mental list of conversations I needed to brace for. Daniel was still asleep, sunlight cutting softly across the room. And for the first time in months, I felt unguarded. It was unsettling. At work, the structure held. That part surprised no one. Clear authority has a way of calming even the most chaotic environments. People stopped asking who was really in charge. Decisions moved faster. Problems surfaced earlier, before they metastasized into politics. What surprised me was how little resistance there was once the uncertainty ended. People don't crave hierarchy as much as they crave clarity. The board meetings became procedural, predictable. The drama had burned itself out. What remained was execution. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt exposed. Without the constant pushback from my family, I was forced to confront a question I'd avoided for years. Who was I when I wasn't reacting to them? That question arrived in unexpected ways. My mother sent a handwritten note. No accusations, no apologies, just a brief message. I'm trying to understand where I went wrong. I don't know if I can yet, but I'm thinking. I read it twice, then folded it and put it away. My father sent nothing. Mark sent another voicemail, this one longer, less defensive. I don't know how to start over, he said, but I think I need to. I didn't respond, not out of punishment, out of honesty. I wasn't ready to renegotiate relationships that had always required me to shrink. At the company, a senior manager requested a private meeting. She'd been there longer than I had, loyal to my father, quietly observant. I owe you an apology, she said once the door was closed. For what? I asked. For seeing your competence as a threat instead of an asset, she replied. I assumed your silence meant agreement. I nodded. That's a common mistake. She smiled faintly. You changed the culture without making it hostile. That's rare. I thanked her. After she left, I sat there longer than necessary, absorbing the weight of what she'd said. I hadn't needed to become cruel to become effective. That realization mattered. The real test came at Easter. My mother invited Daniel and me to lunch. Neutral. Low pressure. No extended family. I debated declining. Daniel didn't push either way. You don't owe them access, he said simply. In the end, I went. The house felt smaller than I remembered. Less charged. My mother moved carefully, like someone navigating unfamiliar furniture. We talked about weather, about work, about nothing. Finally, she set her fork down. I didn't protect you, she said quietly. I protected the system. I waited. I told myself it was the same thing, she continued. It wasn't. That was as close to accountability as she'd ever come. I don't need you to understand everything, I said. I need you to stop assuming you know what's best for me. She nodded slowly. I'm trying. I believed her. Or at least, I believed she was uncomfortable enough to be sincere. My father didn't join us. That boundary held. A week later, the board initiated a leadership review process. Not for me, for the future. Succession planning. Formalized. Transparent. I led the session, but didn't dominate it. I invited dissent, documented it, incorporated it where it made sense. One of the directors asked me privately why I wasn't consolidating more power. Because I don't want anyone to need to dismantle this again, I said. He smiled. You learned from the right failure. At home, Daniel noticed the change too. You're lighter, he said one night, but also sad. Yes, I replied. Those aren't opposites. Do you miss them? I miss who I thought they were, I said, and who I thought I had to be. That truth lingered. The final loose end arrived in the form of a legal notice, a procedural one. My father formally relinquishing his remaining advisory role. No drama, no contest, just a signature. When the document crossed my desk, I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. I signed my portion and forwarded it to legal. That evening, I took the leather planner my mother had given me months earlier and opened it again. This time, I didn't write a warning or a defense. I wrote a single line. I choose myself without apology. I closed the planner and placed it on the shelf. The next chapter of my life wouldn't be about revenge. It wouldn't even be about justice. It would be about something far more difficult. Living without asking permission. And that, I realized, was the real consequence they'd never anticipate. They taught me control. I had learned freedom. The last thing to change was the silence. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of obligation. For most of my life, silence had meant waiting. Waiting for approval. Waiting for the next expectation. Waiting to be told what role I was supposed to play so the system stayed intact. Even when no one was speaking, the rules were loud. Now, the silence felt different. It didn't ask anything of me. The company moved forward without drama. Quarterly results improved. The board settled into a rhythm that didn't revolve around personalities. New leaders emerged because they were capable, not because of their last names. One afternoon, during a routine review, an analyst referred to a policy change as the gray framework. I paused. What do you mean? She looked slightly embarrassed. It's just what people call it now. The transparency rules, the documentation requirements, the checks. I nodded once. Carry on. I didn't correct her. I didn't claim it. But later, alone in my office, I sat with that moment longer than I expected. For years, my name had been something my family used when convenient, ignored when inconvenient. Now it was attached to structure, to clarity, to something that would outlast me. That mattered. My relationship with my parents settled into something distant, but civil. My mother sent occasional updates, neutral, carefully worded. I replied when I chose to. My father remained quiet. I stopped interpreting that as rejection. Sometimes, silence is simply the absence of entitlement. Mark moved out of state. I heard through mutual contacts that he'd taken a mid-level role at a smaller firm. No legacy, no shortcuts, just work. I hoped he learned something. I didn't need to know. The final family gathering I attended was my grandmother's memorial service months later. Not the funeral. This one was smaller, intentional. She'd planned it herself. There was a moment during the service when the officiant spoke about the unseen strength in a family. I almost smiled. Afterward, as people drifted away, my mother stood beside me. She would be proud of you, she said quietly. I looked at the photograph of my grandmother on the table. The sharp eyes, the knowing smile. I know, I replied, and for the first time, that confidence didn't feel like defiance. It felt like peace. At home that night, Daniel poured us both a glass of wine. No celebration, no speeches. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd stayed quiet? He asked. Yes, I said. Sometimes. And? I think I would have disappeared in plain sight, I replied, and everyone would have called it harmony. He nodded. I'm glad you didn't. So am I. The story people like to tell about revenge is simple. Someone is wronged, someone strikes back. Balance is restored. Real life is messier. This wasn't about revenge. It was about betrayal that didn't scream. about family drama that wore politeness like a disguise, about being excluded slowly, professionally, lovingly, until you almost believed it was your fault. The payback wasn't public humiliation. It was regaining authorship of my own life. The tables didn't turn because I shouted. They turned because I stopped holding them steady for everyone else. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Love without boundaries becomes control. Family without accountability becomes injustice. And silence, when it's demanded, is never neutral. Choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you visible. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt excluded, manipulated, or quietly erased by people who claim to love you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share where you're listening from. And if stories like this matter to you, please like and subscribe so more voices like this one get heard. Some endings aren't loud, they're just final. And sometimes that's the most powerful kind of karma there is.